This episode is sponsored by SumUp, the payments provider for small businesses. Choose from in-store and remote payment solutions with no monthly costs. Visit sumup.co.uk.
Welcome to First Voice podcast, brought to you by First Voice magazine, the official flagship magazine of the Federation of Small Businesses. FV is the go-to podcast for news, tips, and important information for small businesses. This particular episode is entitled COVID-19 and Cashless Payments, How Small Businesses Can Adapt, and it's brought to you by First Voice and payment specialists, SumUp. The COVID-19 pandemic has understandably accelerated the use of cashless transactions, forcing company policies and consumer habits to shift all around the globe. In this podcast, we'll explore exactly what that means for small businesses and how they can adapt their payment strategies to survive and thrive in the pandemic and beyond. I'm Jon Watkins, your host for the podcast, and to discuss this crucial topic for small businesses, I'm pleased to say I'm joined today by Alex von Schirmeister from payment specialists SumUp. Alex, welcome.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the very warm welcome and introduction.
Okay, before we get into our detailed conversation, we'd like to just get the creative juices flowing a little bit and relax you with a 60-second quick-fire Q&A about things that aren't directly related to this topic, but give us a little insight into you as a person. So let's kick off. Any unusual hobbies?
I don't know if unusual, John, but I'm currently studying for my WSET exam, which I'm sitting in January. So that's the Wine and Spirits Education Trust. So I guess wine and wine tasting and wine collecting is one of my hobbies.
Sounds like a good hobby to me. How about your favorite band or musician?
Oh, I'm gonna show my age here. Probably toss up between Dire Straits and Pink Floyd.
Great choices. What's the last movie you saw?
Frankly, I've been doing quite a bit of catching up on movies that I've been wanting to watch and I just didn't have time for. So I think the last one was 1917, the Sam Mendes movie, which is probably about a year old.
What inspires you?
You know, John, this is going to sound a bit cheesy maybe, but I think during lockdown, it's mostly children. I find, even in a conversation with my own children, but even with friends and their children and the younger generation, because parents and children are spending so much more time together and having actual thoughtful conversations, including conversations around the environment, around politics and kind of political consequences. I just really think that kind of the new generation is hopefully growing up much more involved and much more activist than certainly my generation was. So currently that's inspiring me right now this week.
That's very insightful. Thank you. Mountain or beach holidays for you?
I'm a mountains guy, but I follow my wife to the beach quite often.
Yeah. You a pizza or a pasta guy?
I'm a pasta person.
And finally, cats or dogs?
I love big cats, but obviously you can't have those as a pet. I don't have any pets. If I did have a pet, it would be a dog, though, not a cat.
Right. Now we're all relaxed into this. Let's crack on with what we're really here to talk about today. How have cashless payments helped retailers and other traders cope with COVID restrictions and help them reassure customers, Alex?
Sure. John, I mean, ironically, I guess cashless payments kind of suddenly found themselves very much in the conversation around the pandemic and COVID, just because they happen to be a very convenient way not to physically touch certainly cash, right? Whether that's bills or coins, but now including not even touching a card or a credit card because you can, or a device, right? Because with the contactless function, you can just hover your card over a device, or if you have your card programmed into your phone, you can use Apple Pay and Google Pay for those payments. And so I think a phenomenon that we were watching anyway, mostly for convenience reasons, right? A lot of consumers just no longer want to go to an ATM and have to extract cash every so often, and they don't want to be pulling out the wallet as often. This convenience phenomenon that we were observing regardless suddenly finds itself very much in in the storm of the pandemic. And I think retailers very quickly understood that the additional benefit besides convenience for cashless payments was this notion of, look, we're not physically touching cash, and you can pay, even through a plexiglass window or through a plastic curtain. And we just see retailers having adopted that very, very quickly if they hadn't already.
Yeah, from a reassurance point of view, in terms of being contactless and within the restrictions, you can see the benefit there, can't you?
Yeah, it's been unbelievable to watch how retailers, and especially the very small businesses and retailers and entrepreneurs, how incredibly adaptive they've proven to be and how resilient they've proven to be. And obviously that doesn't take away from the hardship and the suffering from having had extended lockdowns and many of them still being in a very fragile situation. I acknowledge that. But there is another effect, which is it has really brought out quite a bit of inventiveness and creativity. So we're seeing, I'm sure, John, you've seen it, right? If you go to your hairdresser and you see how they've physically changed around their internal decoration and layout to make sure that they provide safety, right? Retailers that have put up windows or plexiglass, etc. It's quite incredible. And I think, payments and the way they've handled the payment situation, and in many cases, to the extent that they've now adopted payment devices or payment infrastructure they didn't have before, it's quite phenomenal. I was even at a pizzeria a few months ago where they had kind of glued a payment device onto one of those big wooden pallets that you normally use to throw your pizza in and out of the oven. And so they were just reaching out with this pizza pallet with a glued-on device on that. So it's kind of an example of how people are being creative and making sure that they maintain consumption and maintain safety for their clients while they're also obviously keeping their businesses going.
Yeah, there's no doubt we've seen great adaptability and flexibility. It's been really fantastic to see. It's allowed a lot of small businesses to keep operating, right? How has the current situation impacted payment volumes and whether there's been changes as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, they have. And we certainly see it at SumUp, John. Obviously, because we have hundreds of thousands of merchants that use the SumUp devices, the data that we see in terms of the transactions they are performing, I think, quite indicative of certain trends. So there's a few things we're seeing. The first one, obviously, are higher amount of card transactions, and we can only assume that is mostly because it's cannibalizing cash transactions. So many of these merchants that were doing a certain percentage of cash and a certain percentage in cards are just very, very heavily skewing towards more card transactions. The other thing we're seeing is that the average amount of these transactions is lowering slightly. And we typically attribute that to the fact that in many cases, and this is very different from one country to another, but in many cases, in many, especially continental European countries, consumers were still used to using cash for the smaller amounts, oftentimes because a merchant wouldn't accept a card for smaller amounts, or oftentimes just because you were used to using your couple of coins or couple of bills to still pay for your bread or your croissant or your coffee. That is starting to go away. So now even those smaller transactions are being paid for with a card. Many merchants have taken away that restriction or limitation about the transaction limit. And so that's pulling down the averages slightly. And finally, the other thing we're also seeing, though, is more contactless transactions of higher amounts. And as you probably know, the schemes, MasterCard and Visa, et cetera, have worked with the banks and the payment authorities in most countries to increase the limit of contactless. In the UK, it used to be £30, and now that's £45. So you're now able to pay a higher amount purely contactless without having to put or shove your card inside a device and punch in your PIN.
Yeah, I guess the message there is that while restrictions are there and we need to be contactless, the shift towards card payments was speeding up and we were heading in that direction beforehand.
Yeah, that's right. It was very much a journey we were on. And if anything, I think the pandemic is accelerating some of these trends or kind of phenomena we were seeing. Again, I think the starting place of different countries across Europe is very different. We have countries that were much more advanced in terms of card transactions versus cash transactions anyway. Within countries such as the UK, we see certain cities that are more advanced than other cities. You obviously have kind of urban areas, rural areas. And what we're now seeing is a pretty significant acceleration and catch up from most people to more card transactions, and within the card transactions, more often than not, to contactless card transactions.
Yeah, and I guess for small businesses listening to this, many will be using cashless payments, but some will not. And I guess they will be thinking about how to make that transition and any security issues they may face. So, Alex, can you explain how they can make that happen?
Yeah, well, John, I mean, that's very much the genesis of SumUp, to be honest, right? When we were founded, it was exactly on the principle of, look, this shouldn't be so difficult, right? How do we make it incredibly easy for very small companies and entrepreneurs and traders to transition from cash to card without having to go to the bank, without having to look at their entire IT infrastructure and the security and the insurances and very complicated. And not just SumUp, I think in general, you see many startups, especially in the fintech space, but also other tech spaces, doing exactly that, just identifying the fact that there was a vast opportunity to render services much more simple, much more affordable, without all that legacy infrastructure that many of the banks and larger firms bring. And so, oftentimes what happens nowadays is a small firm that wants to get a cashless payment. SumUp's obviously an example of that, but I'm aware we have competitors. We just make it really easy. You can order your device online and get it delivered to you in, less than 48 hours. If you're really pressed, you can also walk into your local retailer, right? We have many retailers across the UK and across Europe that sell the devices on their shelves. And once you have the device in your hands, you can set up a SumUp account online in just a matter of minutes and then start transacting. Just the entire kind of ominous, oh my God, I need a new infrastructure and I need a new process. We've just done away with that. And the way the actual billing or the pricing works in terms of taking a flat transaction fee off every payment, again, very easy, very transparent. There are, and again, this is true for most of these fintech startups. We're doing away with many of the complex monthly maintenance fees and rental fees and hidden charges, and just making it really easy for small merchants to get their businesses up and running, and so they can spend their time doing what they love, which is serving the clients and customers, and less of their time having to worry about how do I get paid. Brilliant. Can you share some examples of successful implementations that you've seen, how this has helped firms, given them a competitive advantage? Yeah, I mean, in general, I think all merchants that have moved from pure cash acceptance to card acceptance, they're seeing their business grow, right? There's an actual revenue growth because you're no longer turning away business. You're not turning away a consumer that may be walking in the door and is not carrying any cash. And we're increasingly seeing that, again, oftentimes in certain urban areas, less and less consumers carry cash on them. And hence, they will seek out and they will very specifically and exclusively only go to businesses that take a card. So it's become more than a competitive advantage. It almost becomes a competitive necessity. The other thing we've seen, and again, the pandemic has certainly accelerated many of these particular examples, we're seeing businesses becoming quite creative in accepting payments in different ways. And we've certainly launched products to help them alongside as well. The most obvious one, when the lockdowns happened the first time around, and sadly now again, many businesses are not able to transact face to face, but they are still able to deliver their services or ship. Again, many of those businesses didn't then have an online payment solution. They only had a payment solution where a physical customer standing in their shop with a card was able to pay. We now have Payment Link, which is a mobile payment solution. So a merchant can generate the payment on their device, whether it's a mobile device or a laptop or a computer. They can send the payment link via SMS or WhatsApp to a merchant, to a consumer. The consumer can then settle the payment on their mobile phone and the payment is made. And obviously many restaurants, caterers, for example, pubs are using that to take payment prior to then shipping out food to a customer. And so that's a very good example where we've seen cashless payments, and especially in this case, distance payments. And last example, maybe, John, I was actually at the British Street Food Festival in Reading just last weekend,
right.
And just in time before this recent and more strict lockdown. And what ended up happening is because of at this point, it wasn't the lockdown yet, it was phase 2 or phase 3 regulations in the UK. Many of these food trucks were being asked to serve the food to sitting customers at tables, which of course kind of defeats the whole purpose of people queuing up at a food truck. Well, again, we were able to help in this case by allowing those food trucks to put their menu in an online store format, which we provided, which is a very easy way to basically create an online store. In this case, that online store just served the individual menu items. The consumers sitting at tables were able to, through a QR code, access those menus, order the foods, pay for the food online, and then the person from the food truck would just walk out to the table with a table number and deliver the food. So again, it's one example where we're seeing either industries or individual merchants very rapidly adapting and finding the right products in a product portfolio or in a payments ecosystem to not only survive, but to actually become very competitive during these times.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting for our audience, that payment offerings are not just offering an alternative during a restriction, but it's helping pivot their businesses so they can turn into delivery businesses, for example, allowing businesses to move online, for example. They might not be able to operate as a restaurant, but as an online delivery service, they can. And those payment processes can really help with that. We did ask for some questions in advance for people to send those in to us, things they wanted to ask. First one of those, do you need to be tech savvy to use SumUp?
No, you don't. And actually, it's a big area of focus of ours to precisely make all of our services and products and devices as user-friendly and as intuitive as possible. Right there, when I look at our teams internally, it's probably one of our bigger teams are the kind of what we call the product and engineering team, and their focus is make sure that the usability of our products is so intuitive that anyone can use them. And I think the reality, John, nowadays, I think our merchants no longer need to look for these kind of boil the ocean, huge tech solutions that do everything, right? You can very easily just tap a foot in the water and start with something small. Maybe depending on the business you're running, you're looking for an invoicing solution. Well, then you can adopt an invoicing product, which is very easy to use. Yes, it may not have all the bells and whistles of integrating with your tax software and what have you not, but it will certainly do the trick for what many small merchants need initially. Same thing on the card payments. You don't need to go and run to your bank and set up an unbelievably complex, IT secure infrastructure that talks to your cash register and your inventory systems. You can start by just taking card payments very easily, very quickly, and very intuitively. And then there are always options to either upgrade those solutions or extend them. We obviously work on trying to offer those upgrade solutions so that our merchants stay with us. But we also know that certain merchants sometimes reach a critical size where they need products that are more sophisticated. But I'd certainly to the non-tech savvy merchants that are listening to this, I would say, tip a foot in the water, if you will. There are many products out there that are incredibly simple to use, and they will certainly help you get started. And then the other. Sorry if I'm kind of being a bit long on this, but talk to your peers. Right, the one thing we've observed, which is quite heartwarming, especially during the pandemic, is we see in social media many of merchants and many of our merchants just exchanging stories amongst themselves, exchanging best practices, helping each other. We often see it, or I've seen it when I go to, say, organic food markets around London where I live, where over time I just see the adoption of our SumUp devices. Initially at one booth or stall, and then it's kind of 3 and 4, and then within a few months I now see them kind of everywhere. And a lot of that is just merchants are helping each other. They're exchanging ideas. They're talking to each other about what they're using and how to help each other.
Does the card reader provide receipts?
Yes, it does two ways, actually. We always provide an electronic receipt, and the merchant is then able to share that receipt via email or via SMS or via WhatsApp with a client that just acquired something. Or we also have a card reader, which is kind of an additional piece of hardware that we sell alongside with the card reader. And so that's a printer for 3G card readers that actually prints a physical paper receipt.
Great, good to cover that. Another question. In your view, Alex, do you think these public health interventions will have a permanent effect on retail payments?
I think they will, John, on various dimensions, right? I do think a lot of these companies, big and small, that have fundamentally reinvented their business models. Those business models are not necessarily bad business models. They may have been triggered by a pandemic, but ultimately, some of them I think are here to stay. The way people buy online and buy their groceries online. There's been a lot in the British press around how people who were not doing grocery online shopping before have now adopted it and are likely to stay with it. Again, restaurants that have discovered that there's a delivery business alongside maybe their physical business may very well choose to stay with that. We certainly see a lot of the businesses that did kind of reinvent their business model during the first wave of the lockdown, and they just stuck with it during the second wave. After lockdowns ended, they stuck with that. They may have gone back to their core business model, but they didn't just completely eliminate the new business model they had invented. I think we'll see quite a bit of that. The last one, and this is one where I think I'm more speaking of my personal hope rather than any evidence that we've seen yet, is I do think it's bringing about a national conversation around buying local, helping our local tradespeople, certainly in our neighborhoods. And I do think that there is an opportunity, again, a hopeful opportunity, that the fabric of the way our society consumes and the way that we also choose to, through our consumption, give back to local merchants and not always the obvious, very large, either international or national platforms, may just bring about, I think, a conscious consumption, which is certainly very interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that. Any final tips for business owners trying to navigate cashless payment right now?
No, I think my biggest tip is, don't be intimidated, don't be afraid of it. When you're a small business and a small merchant, or you're just starting an entrepreneur, you want to worry about other things and how do you take payment. And the reality is the technology that we provide and the technology that other startups provide, not just in the payment space, but, I'm thinking insurtech, I'm thinking, certainly fintech, I'm thinking of a lot of other services that are now being offered to small businesses. We can take a lot of the pain away. Right? We launched a campaign recently saying, look, complicated, here is simple. And I think what we're trying to do in that campaign is we acknowledge how difficult it is to build a business and to keep a business up and running and to grow the business. We'd love to just be able to take at least one pain point away from businesses, which is the payment side. I think because of technology, our merchants have opportunity to have a lot of these smaller things just taken care of quite simply so that they can focus on serving their customers and growing their business, which I think is what they all want.
Alex, I think that brings us to a good conclusion for this episode of our regular podcast. It just remains for me to thank you for sharing those insights and for the guidance on how small businesses can adapt in this difficult time, but also equip themselves for the future. For those of you listening today, do please keep an eye out for future episodes of the First Voice podcast as we explore other topics that can help small businesses move forward. Many thanks.
This episode is sponsored by SumUp, the payments provider for small businesses. Choose from in-store and remote payment solutions with no monthly costs. Visit sumup.co.uk.